Today, we are looking at graveyards and their cultural importance to Britain and Europe in general. This is a non-conformist graveyard behind me. Non-conformist meaning that these were the revolutionaries, the radicals of their time, and they've been stored here from around the country as a way of preserving them and their legacy. Now, during Cromwell's era, during the 1600s, the Church of England reigned supreme. Puritanism reigned supreme. And these are the sort of people that would have been either involved in the Civil War, in the New Model Army, or they would have been moving on to sections such as Calvinism, Quakerism, and other forms of radical Christianity, which in those days would have been their version of Bolshevism, socialism. They came with women's rights and a whole host of New Age ideas. Now, directly behind you is the house of John Wesley. Now, John Wesley was a massive name as a Methodist, and that was another sect which came out of Anglicanism, Church of England, C of E. So it would be fitting that he stood right there. As you can see, the world is my parish. The Puritans did a lot of missionary work, and is why that there's so much non-Catholic Christianity around the world today. So what we're going to do now is go and have a look at the plaques written outside of the cemetery so you can see for yourself. Now, this cemetery was most used and most famous for its time during the reign of Charles II, because Charles II actually had a very unfortunate reign. He saw his dad beheaded, he had to flee. When he was finally brought back to his plastic monarchy, he had to face two great tragedies. One was the plague, and the other was the 1666 Great Fire of London. And the plague actually ran into the Great Fire the same year. And James II actually had to flee the city, which put a very bad taste in the mouth of the people who were suffering from the plague. So let's go over and have a look at what's written outside. Now, for some people, they might think this is a macabre subject or a depressing subject, but we're not just here to speak about the subjects of Anglicanism, Christianity, politics. No, that's a secondary role in this program. That's not as important to me in what we're doing here. What we're doing here is pointing out that when you walk into our cemeteries, our preserved cemeteries, you're walking back in time. If you were to look down the road, you see reminders of London's past, right? But if you went too far, we're in a particularly nice area, right? But if you turn around, you'll see what I mean. Here is the new London. Here's the reminder of what today is. So when you walk into a 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century cemetery, you are walking back in time. Not just metaphorically, but literally, because the people there are the reminders that that time actually existed. As mad as that sounds, we didn't see it, you know? And when you see the graves of famous people, it is, or people that have been made famous over time, it is a very strong reminder, not only that they did exist, but that timeline was so relevant to us. It's not just a story, it's not just great expectations, it's history. So anyway, let's go over and have a look. Because the bones that were brought here from the plague, they had originally been kept in St. Paul's, and this is a very, very interesting location, whether you're treating it politically or culturally. So for context of where I am before I actually read that, that's Old Street Roundabout just at the end of the road. We're in the city of London. So this was a vibrant hub during the 1600s. and you would have had a lot of people suffering inanely from the plague. The Great Fire that followed it, though it was heartbreaking, it wasn't horrific. Very few people died. It wasn't the same as being locked in your house to die alongside your father or your son and be guarded, and it was a horrific nature, having to drag your own relatives' bodies out of the front door and watch them thrown into ditches. It was a horrific time. It's one of those events that it's actually downplayed, and when you stop and really think about how bad the plague was, it really is quite heartbreaking to put yourself in that scenario. So, in saying that, we don't know what has happened to the plague bones that were once in here. We don't know where they've gone. So I'm going to read this now. So the burial ground of the non-conformists, once again the non-conformists, being radicals, not conforming with the legal consensus of the time, e.g. Anglicanism, doing as Parliament tells you. Known anciently as Bunhill, in the fields, was enclosed with a brick wall at the sole charge of the City of London in the mayoralty of Sir John Lawrence, Knight Anno Domini 1665. The sun's gleaming on it, it's a bit difficult. And afterwards, the gates hereof were built and finished in the mayoralty of Sir Thomas Bloodworth, Knight, Anno Domini 1666. So the burial ground was badly damaged during the war of 1939 to 35, so World War II, the Blitz, which also damaged another cemetery we're going to be looking at around the corner. Restoration undertaken by the Corporation of London in 1964, including the laying out of part of the ground as a public garden, because much of this cemetery is inaccessible apart from a little public square. There's just another sign over here. At the time of the closing of this ground in 1852, more than 120,000 bodies were alleged to have been interred therein. In the year 1867, it was committed by Act of Parliament to the care of the Corporation of London by having them been planted and restored for public resort. It was opened by the Right Honourable James Clark Lawrence, MP, Lord Mayor, on the 14th of October 1869. Charles Reed, Esquire, MP, Chairman of the Committee for the Preservation of this ground. Okay, so why don't we now have a walk in? And this is one of the few cemeteries, as I said, famously, you can't actually access many of the graves, which is a great shame, but at the same time, at least they're protected. So this location is full of names that during that time would have been considered radicals. Because bear in mind, during the 1600s, blasphemy laws were very much in place, and the likes of Cromwell, despite ruling like an authoritarian, still allowed these sort of radical sections of Christianity to exist, because where he had turned on popery, on organized religion, they was left sort of in this state of limbo where anything goes. So in the end, Parliament did put its foot down and say that we've had enough of you radicals. But in the meantime, they were free to build influence, build character and meet, and many of the names here would have been among them. There is nearby a Quaker cemetery, and the Quakers were the most radical among them. But irrelevant of who's buried here, just for a moment, especially if you come from a newer country, the States, Australia. Just take a moment to appreciate what you're looking at. People walk past these graveyards in their millions. Just the floor here, look at the floor here. It's a very special place, a very special city is London. And turn around, here's a regular site for people that know graveyards and know London. The old tree struggling to live among the medieval slabs that it lives inside of. The familiar sight of nature of the squirrel resting, he's just run off there, just resting on the graves, almost as if this wasn't stuck in the middle of London. So this graveyard has a few important names that we're going to quickly look at, and those names are what we'd call radicals, people that supported the Enlightenment, would have been heavily against the Pope, papacy in general, Catholicism in general, would have been against the idea of staunch religiosity over personal outcome. The idea of knowing what's going to happen to you against your will, that was a very Calvinist, very Catholic idea. The idea of predetermined reality. You cannot save yourself. This is your fate. Tough. If you're not part of a certain class system, if you're not born into certain things, tough. Your fate is sealed. Whereas the more radicals, like the Quakers, they believed that they were in control of their destiny, and their connection with God was just as strong as any pope or cardinal. Now, something fascinating that happened during the 1600s. Now, the plague, which was the worst of its kind and the last of its kind, the worst since the Black Death, the official Black Death. It's interesting how the bodies were treated because of something called purgatory. Now, in the world of Anglicanism, in the Church of England, purgatory was brought into practice. Now, what this means is, the way that bodies are treated is, if the bones no longer have flesh, their soul is no longer present, meaning you can kick them about. They no longer matter. The person is not there. So cartloads of bones were dragged here, allegedly, and dumped, which is why it's also known as Bunhill Cemetery, because somewhere here there was a small mountain of bones. And there was nothing morally wrong with this because of the idea that in that timeline, that Christendom had adopted the idea that flesh was the spirit. So it's also a very cunning way, in my opinion, of saying this huge group of people that we have either sent to war and died, or that we've let die, or we've murdered, we can group them here together without having to give them individual graves. That's one way you could look at it, because it's a religious way of telling the populace, oh, we don't have the time or the resources to actually bury these people individually. But because of that is why it was considered okay to have a mountain of bones just sitting in this graveyard. Now, just in front of me is the grave of John Bunyan. And he is a famous Anglican. This is John Bunyan's effigy. John Bunyan was an English writer and Puritan preacher. And he was best remembered as the author of the Christian's allegory, The Pilgrim's Process. This would also become an influential literary model. He wrote quite a few other things, and these would end up becoming sermons. Now, what makes an effigy special, this is an effigy, is that it's a depiction of the person. So that actually looks like John Bunyan. So if you see many portraits or statues that have been made in the past, depending on the era, they're done in a generic fashion. and they all look very similar, and it's meant to hide their blemishes and make everyone look very wholesome and healthy. But an effigy is different. An effigy captures you for how you really look. More time and effort goes into an effigy. It's no longer possible to be buried here. So the people that are buried here, they will be historical relics for years to come. Once again, the first name we come across living evidence of the importance this place was to the radicals and the changing names and forming Christianity's forever changing path. And as I said, it's unfortunate we can't get in here. If you was to be suspicious, you'd think that they didn't want you seeing the names on the graves. So this extravagant, what I can imagine was a highly expensive grave, is the wife of Sir Gregory Page Bart. Now, he was a merchant in the 1700s and an important politician. There's quite a few merchants of the City of London that are buried here, and these would have been what we call radical funders, shall we say. We have another merchant just over here. And this little grave here, which looks so quiet and modest, if you was to just not know where you was. If you wasn't to know where you was, you'd think, oh, what's this nice little grave here? But this is Joseph Hardcastle, the family grave of Joseph Hardcastle, a merchant of the City of London. Lies beneath the lawn in front of this stone. He was a founder of the British and Foreign Bible Society and first treasurer of the London Missionary Society, and was associated with William Wilberforce at the campaign to abolish slavery. These are the height of institutional liberalism. Also, which I find incredibly hypocritical, is the anti-slavery attitude that these names claim to have. A lot of the merchant class were, if not related to slave traders, were directly slave traders themselves. And that even fell under some of the anti-slavery religious groups, which claimed to be in aid of liberalism, of liberal rights, of emancipating slaves. There were people that would walk around this graveyard and herald these people as the heroes of how the modern age came about. But once again, I'm trying not to get too political here and just trying to emphasize, because even if you are not a fan of, if say you're not a fan of Catholics, you're not a fan of Protestants, you're not a fan of the regime of Parliament, their graves are still interesting. The history that took place is still fascinating. You don't have to support it. And if you are knowledgeable on a said subject, sometimes looking at the thing in question really brings it to life for you and helps you. Sometimes you can read thousands and thousands of words, and just looking at something for a few moments can snap you into a reality that you've never seen before. So I mean, these are all even the less known names. You know, this person's a surgeon, so you can imagine, right? In 1700s, in the 1700s, being a surgeon is a big thing. You know, it's still a big thing today, but can you imagine how prestigious you'd have been as a surgeon then? I mean, let's have it right. One of the main reasons so many people were, two reasons, were dying and sick during the plague was one, they couldn't afford medical care even if they wanted to, and two, medical care was insane. You know, it thought dirty air and crazy remedies were the problem. So even if you could afford to see a doctor, there's not a lot they're going to do for you. They might stick a few leeches on your groin if you're lucky. Another important name, clearly, a reverend. Another powerful example of Puritan reign. And as you can see here, he ran St. John's College in Cambridge, right? So it brings us back to, why is he buried here? Why are any of these people buried here? It's because this is a location which is to celebrate the radicals of that era. Another huge indication of wealth is the age that some of these people are living to during this time. We can see here, this chap, and Mary, his wife, died at the age 91. Now, he died at 66, but we all know men don't last as long as women usually. But she died at 91. Now, imagine the sort of income you need to be that healthy during the 1800s. That's income, that's real money. This episode, episodes like it, are to remind us of our history and our culture, and to step back into that timeline and to escape the thing that we see every moment of our day, which is that. So now if you turn back round this way for me, cameraman, a quick reminder of exactly why we're making this and what it's about, because here we are, once again, I'm back in time, because this place here is preserved, and that place there, it's just replaceable rubbish. Now, it's not unique for this to be a woodland wildlife reserve. Many cemeteries are, but it is unique for it to be closed. We should be allowed to walk around and have a look. After all, this is not just my history, but the history of anyone of this nation, truly of this nation. So I just don't see why they think it's okay to close it up. Many other cemeteries aren't closed up. I know the one in Highgate you have to pay to get in, which is ironic considering one of the writers of the Communist Manifesto was buried there. Because they can't be sure if this was definitely used for the plague pits. And there's no recollection of where the bones went that were dragged here from St. Paul's, that were left to ferment in a mountain. But I know London. I've worked on demolition jobs. I've seen underground. And in my estimation, there's going to be plenty of bodies beneath this reservation, beneath the lawn, probably quite far down. But I would imagine that there's far more bodies here than meets the eye, especially having been so relevant during the time of the plague. Can't trust no one. This is the monument to Daniel Defoe. Now, he wrote Robinson Crusoe. As you know, that's a massive story relevant in English fictional history. And here we've got this monument is a result of an appeal in the Christian World newspaper to the boys and girls of England for funds to place a suitable memorial upon the grave of Daniel Defoe. It represents the united contributions of 1,700 persons. So a lot of people put their hand in their pocket for this. But this is a writer that created something that many people read. This story allegedly was supposed to be only second to the Bible in popularity at one point. It certainly seems impressive, and it's one of the few graves you can actually walk up to. Now, this is one of the graves for William Blake. Now, William Blake saw England as, quote, the New Jerusalem. And as you can see on this slab, it actually says that nearby lie the remains, because no one knew where he was actually buried for a long time. So that's all we had, nearby. Until recently, it was discovered. It's just around here. Written on his grave is one of his famous quotes. "I give you the end of a golden string, only wind it into a ball. I will lead you at heaven's gate, built in Jerusalem's wall." So this is a very strong reminder of his belief systems and what he wished for England. During his life, William Blake wasn't that famous. He was made more famous in death. But as you can see, the connection with that of Israel, with the East, was far more relevant to the Puritans and the radicals of the time than, say, trying to connect with even pre-Catholic England or Britain. They had absolutely no interest with the historical roots of England and were far more interested in bringing the historical roots of the East into England. And it seems now, I'm sure you'll agree that I could go through every one of these graves, and like you could if you had the time, and I'm sure every one of them's got something interesting to tell us. But all we can do is look at some of the names that we have time for and reflect, and hope that people like yourselves will come out and start spending time in these places as a bit of reflection. As I said, you might find it macabre, but history and truth is. Like in most cemeteries, even the benches are relevant. Presented to the Corporation of London by St Martin's Corporation. Now, what you often get is in memory of, or this bench is dedicated to, and it will be a special person that either sat here a lot, was one of the gardeners, or just an important part of the community. And that's another special thing that British graveyards do. And remember, I'm a few minutes walk from Old Street roundabout. Around me is the City of London. It's very quiet here. And all of these graves have entire worlds that we couldn't fathom. They all took part in huge parts of history that I'm sure I would love, and many people would love, to be able to look into. This is the radical graveyard. So even if these people might have been up to no good, had bad intentions, it's still fascinating in itself. And especially it's fascinating that it's been so well preserved. When so much historically relevant things of ours are destroyed, you know, it does seem an oddity that certain facets of history are preserved in the way they are. So just before we take off, we're going to have a look at the sign. You can see here there's two Cromwells buried here. Would certainly explain why you're not allowed in there. And there's Blake, there's Defoe. There's a few famous names here, and here we can see that there's a sunken tomb, which has certainly been another reason not to let you in there. See? And then obviously it gives reference to Bunhill, and what it sees its most famous grave as William Blake. But as I said, I'm sure each of these graves have just as much relevance in their own way. We come across merchants, we come across all sorts of people, reverends, and these people would have played a huge part in the formation of the world we know today. And remember, a graveyard is never guilty of the crimes of its inhabitants. It's just a reminder of what took place.